So, interesting news has emerged on the COVID front. Professor Sir Jonathan Van-Tam, England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, that is Professor Chris Whitty's second in command, has announced that he's going to leave his role at the end of March. Professor Van-Tam became one of the nation's most familiar faces during the COVID-19 pandemic after he regularly took the podium at Downing Street press conferences next to Boris Johnson and Professor Sir Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for England. He will take up a new role as the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of Nottingham. He said this: "My time as DCMO has been the most challenging of my professional career, especially the COVID response. We all wish COVID had never happened. Notwithstanding, it has been the greatest privilege of my professional career to have served the people of the UK during this time."
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it has been. So Boris Johnson, of course, offered a tribute to Mr. Van-Tam, saying, "I would like to thank Jonathan Van-Tam for his extraordinary contribution to our country and his invaluable advice throughout the pandemic, wishing him all the best for the future," I suppose, as can be expected. And as you can see underneath, Sajid Javid said it has been an honour to work with him, and I'm hugely grateful for his advice and the vital role he has played in our vaccination programme. So pretty standard so far. I couldn't find a response from Keir Starmer, so I did find one from the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, who has said that Van-Tam's efforts throughout this pandemic should be greatly appreciated by the nation. "Thank you for your clarity, expertise and dedication." The most, shall we say, representative tributes, however, I would say, came from Toby Young, which is at least my favourite one so far. So he says, Jonathan Van-Tam is leaving his post as Deputy Chief Medical Officer. The government's senior advisor, who has become a household name, he will leave his post at the end of March. Rats and sinking ships spring to mind. Does that sound about right for you?
It does indeed. I think old Boris is in a bit of hot water about his approach to lockdowns and all of that stuff. And I think Mr. Van-Tam has seen the holes in the hull, to use that sinking ship analogy.
Yeah.
And the first rat to jump clearly must be him.
As a matter of fact, I think that face almost is a picture in itself, isn't it? It's almost as if he's looking at that sinking ship and actually looking at the sinking ship, either having jumped off and thought, you know what, that was a good decision. Because there is, well, in my view, there's second to zero chance that Boris is going to survive whatever Susan Gray's inquiry reveals. It's far too late for Boris at this point to take a dignified exit, but I suppose it's not too late for some of the members of SAGE. Perhaps it will be revealed that Mr. Van-Tam was at the party. I very much doubt it. He didn't seem to be, well, actually, he seems he could be a laugh, unlike Chris Whitty. But it's probably more likely that following it's following the extent that the government has tried to cover its tracks so badly over Partygate, and he just wants nothing to do with it anymore. And
is it even possible to lose dignity when you had none to begin with? I don't know.
It's true, that's true. But then again, there were some examples where you could, some people come to mind where you could make a case for that, as in it's. We don't have time to make a short list as to those with less dignity than Sage, but there is, however,
a very difficult task.
Maybe I'm being slightly optimistic in my thinking here, but maybe Van-Tam's resignation represents an inadvertent acceptance within Sage, or maybe just on his part, of the fact that his work is done, and beyond that, maybe there's an inadvertent acceptance that Sage's work is done, and you have to ask, what purpose will does Sage have now, really? I mean, I know we've been discussing this for a very, very long time now, but now that one of the key figures has actually stepped down, this could precipitate an actual serious public discussion in the mainstream about whether Sage actually need to be at the forefront of the government's policies anymore.
Well, I know that there are some questionable members. I remember one lady, I forget her name, but she is a member of the Communist Party, and it's unsurprising that she lapped up the idea that she could copy Xi Jinping's policies. I mean, it boggles the mind how they came to the conclusion that they just copy the communists when there was a communist in Sage.
It's a very, very useful tool of, I suppose, bringing about the sort of structure that would facilitate communism, isn't it? Lockdowns. I mean, I suppose
makes everyone dependent on the state.
Makes everyone dependent on the state. It sustains a constant climate of fear and submission to big authority. So it's setting all of the psychological tenets, really. So that would make perfect sense. He doesn't strike me as a communist, but I suppose reification is a thing. Maybe he is carrying ideological remnants that he doesn't necessarily consciously believe. Maybe that's just me being overly philosophical. But anyway, let's have a look at the present COVID data. So every COVID conference, many of which Van-Tam attended, saw Sage place a very strong emphasis on the number of rising cases to justify its erring on the side of caution. Whilst cases have indeed shot up in recent weeks, as we can see, with that rise now levelling off somewhat, so case numbers on their own, of course, as we have always known, mean absolutely nothing. And if we move on to the COVID deaths, you can see that there is the smallest possible, if we just scroll down a little bit, that's it. So yes, as you can see, there's the smallest possible correlation on display, if any, between rising cases and deaths.
Well, it probably has something to do with the fact that the government actually had to come out with advice where it's just like, how you tell the common cold between new Omicron symptoms, and it's like, well, if you're getting to that point, then what do we have to worry about?
Yes.
Right?
And this is justified again by the data that I'm going to show up here about healthcare and hospitalisations. And so if we move on to the next one, so yes, whilst you can see that there has been, if we scroll down ever so slightly so we can see the graph again, there has indeed been a rise in hospitalisations. If we scroll down even further to the graph beneath about ventilation beds, I think it might be underneath this. Yes, that's it. So the rate of patients using ventilation beds has been on progressive decline for some time and continues to decline despite the rising cases. So that would suggest that on looking at this data that, well, it's not really worth worrying about.
Well, yeah. I think it was at the beginning of December I had COVID, and I didn't even think it was particularly bad. I thought, oh, this cold's particularly mild. And then just on the off chance, because I was seeing an elderly family, I went and got a test, and it's like, oh, I was actually positive. There we go. But I just had a great time kicking back.
Well, good for you. But no, I think I must have come down with it. But what was it? You know, that time when I was off for a few days and had to take a PCR test. I was very fairly poorly for what was it, about 8 hours, and I woke up feeling somewhat groggy. But 4 hours after that, I was basically perfectly fine. It was the test was negative. Of course, we don't know how accurate. Well, the PCR tests aren't completely accurate.
I did like 3 home tests and they were all negative, and then I got the PCR and it was positive. But then who knows which one's right and which one's wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's
point is I didn't die. And if we move on to the next page here, which shows hospitalisation and death by age, and this is provided by the US Department of Health and Human Services, so it's not from the UK. And you can see that if we scroll down a little bit, that's it. That COVID has always disproportionately affected the over 65s far more. Anyone above that is, well, the retired dependent population. It doesn't affect really children at all. It's never really affected children, that is, unless they have pre-existing conditions. The reason why death threats are not shooting up is for 2 reasons. First, those who were vulnerable enough to not be able to overcome the virus due to health reasons unrelated to COVID have already died, sadly, or been vaccinated, or now have natural antibodies. And the second reason is because, well, the virus, at least now, is getting milder. And if you go on to the next article here, which, as you can see, 96% of the population now have, it's just a little bit further up, now have antibodies. And if 96% of the population now have antibodies, restrictions are counterproductive at this point, because in order to sustain such a resistance, we need essentially to live with the virus, not base our lives trying to avoid it. And again, some are going to be more vulnerable to this than others, like the flu. Some may be justified in getting a booster. My parents, for example, have had the flu vaccine for years and years. I think we're at the point where we can say it's just another form of flu, and that ultimately, in short, where I'm going with this, I'm hoping, this is me being optimistic, that that Jonathan Van-Tam has probably come to the conclusion that Sage doesn't really serve much of a purpose anymore at this point, and that maybe this is why he's decided to call it time, because it's just going to become fetid and frustrating, and those like, well, Chris Whitty are going to be increasingly seen for ultimately what they're doing, and that is trying to make this look worse than it is, because they've never enjoyed such levels of relevance in their lives, even though if they're not aware of it themselves. I don't know, but maybe I'm being slightly hyperbolic. What do you think?
I think that's fair. I mean, the people who all of a sudden have all this power and authority, it's kind of making their careers, isn't it? So they have a vested interest in over-egging the severity of it, because ultimately they stand to gain from it. And the fact that it's all winding down, I mean, that's good. I'm glad to see that it's happening. But It doesn't necessarily mean that the restrictions and things are necessarily over, as we can see, I suppose.
Yeah. But anyway, I would like to end, actually, by having a look at some of his most, the best quotes that the Eye has actually extracted. And I'm not going to go for all of them because we don't have the time, but it's quite entertaining. If you go to the first one, when he said you can't avoid COVID unless you're standing in a meadow alone forever. And that's probably the most base thing he has ever said. This is him admitting that we're just going to have to learn to live with the virus at some point. So, yes, perhaps Sage could take that on board from now on. If we go on to number 5, restrictions are like being in the Grand National. I don't know that much about the Grand National, so I couldn't possibly know what the analogy means. Could you enlighten me?
Well, in the Grand National, because it's a pretty, it's probably the horse race, and there are lots of jumps and things like that. You can never truly know whether your horse is going to make it. It could be the favourite, and it could fall at the first hurdle. So I think that's probably what he's alluding to there.
Oh my God! So that's basically him saying we have no idea what we're doing with the vaccines.
Yes.
Yes, that's
my
almost certainly
understanding
going to
anyway.
have to be deleted from YouTube. So on that note, we'll move on to number 8. Vaccine program is like landing a plane. Well, now at least we can now cast this in the light that it deserves to be casted in saying, well, yes, a plane that has no intention of landing at all, because not landing it is, well, shall we say, somewhat desirable for reasons again I cannot mention on YouTube. So that's probably the best reason, and this is probably not the best place to call it time on the entire matter, and say we should probably say, well, good luck, Mr. Van-Tam, in your new role. Should we thank him for his service? I don't know.
I would have even gone so far as to wish him luck. I wish you contempt, Mr. Van-Tam, for locking us in our homes for 2 years.
Yes, let's run with that. No, thank you.
If you want to see more from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to enjoy all of the premium content we have on the site, such as this premium article by Hugo examining how ordinary people can resist lockdowns. If you prefer to listen to our articles rather than read, we have an audio track recorded by our external reader, John Crow, available to Silver Tier members. You can get access to all of our premium content with a Bronze Tier membership for just £5 a month. If you'd like to stay up to date with all of the content we're putting out on the site, you can also follow Lotus Eaters on Getter at getter.com, and you can follow our individual writers and presenters, such as Callum here. Thank you, and goodbye.